Well, good morning again. We've grown in number, and I'm really grateful for that. Not because I'm about numbers, but because of the people that walked in the door. Really grateful. And you wouldn't know this, but I thought perhaps I had killed Alvin yesterday. Close. He was kind enough to help me with a car issue, and then he and some other guys came out and helped me move stuff out of our trailer into a storage place so I can go fill the trailer again. And really appreciate all of you that were a part of that. And I thought perhaps I had a message on my phone saying you were at the ER or something, but really good to see you, and especially good to see your sweetheart with you. We've been praying a lot for you, Francis. Really grateful to have you here today. So we've been working through this series, Stay Gold. We've been talking about the 7 deadly sins. Is probably why we are killing our attendance. I would imagine that when we start to talk sin, it's not always popular. But honestly, I think it's one of those things. Matter of fact, Donald and I talked about this at lunch a couple of weeks ago. It's really important as a church that we talk about sin. And because without talking about sin, we have no idea just how grateful we are, how much we have to be thankful for that Christ would pay the price for our sin. And so this table means less to us when we don't talk about what he saved us from. And I don't know about you, but I really thought these 7 sins I probably did okay with. There are some sins that I really struggle with. But I remember going into this series like, this is not going to be a terribly painful series to preach. I'm not a wrathful individual, and I'm not a greedy person, but I certainly don't think of myself as a sloth. Maybe a slob once in a while, but a sloth, I don't really think of myself that way. And yet, so far, 2 out of 3 of these messages have just slapped me in the face, saying, wake up. You may not be the person you think you are yet. You're definitely not the person yet that Christ has made you to be. And so I find myself guilty of bronzing my gold medal, of not staying golden in some of these areas. And today is no different. Like when we talked about wrath, I really thought I had wrath under control till I began to understand that, the flip side of wrath is forgiveness. And I don't know about you, but I struggle with that one sometimes. Not in receiving it from the Lord, but in giving it to others. And so that was really good for me. That passage in Matthew chapter 18 was really good for me to revisit. And then last week we talked about the American dream, that it's probably more of an American nightmare. The idea that we're here just to pursue more, when really God says, you have enough. Pursue me, not more. And we talked quite a bit about what that looked like. Well, today is really not that different. Now, I thought going into this, when I first started working on this series, I thought, sloth, that's not me. I'm one of the busiest people I know, just like you are one of the most busy people in the room. We're all busy people. How can we be filled with sloth? And the first time I taught on this series was just a little under a year ago. I was working with some college students, and I was teaching them to teach. And so I remember getting together with the young man who was going to teach on this subject, and we went through the study together and kind of helped prepare the message together. And he said, I got to be honest with you, I'm not very excited to preach about sloth because nobody I know is lazy. He's a 21-year-old guy in college, and he felt like he was busier than anybody that he knew, but everybody he knew was busy. And so we started talking through that a little bit, like what does it mean to be a sloth? Well, he was a science major, so we said, well, what do we know about sloths? And he said, the funniest thing I know about a sloth is this. Do you know that a sloth only comes out of the tree once a week? Once a week, the sloth climbs out of the tree and goes down to go to the bathroom, and then climbs back up in the tree. And if it happens to be raining that day, the sloth is kind of like an 8-year-old in a pool. He doesn't bother to go out of the tree because the rain has him covered. And so sloth to this young man was somebody that just does absolutely nothing. And I think, that's not an unfair idea of what is behind this idea of sloth. But I think we may need to broaden our understanding of what slothfulness is, because it's not about having nothing to do. Sometimes it's about doing the wrong things, like literally doing nothing of value. And so I want to talk a little bit about that today, this idea that, what about being selectively lazy? I don't think anybody in this room is likely a slothful individual. After all, most of you have been here for 3 hours already, or close to it. Today our worship people were here a couple of hours ago preparing, and it never ceases to amaze me. At 7:45, 8 o'clock in the morning, Lindy and the kids are already here working on worship stuff. The kids are putting out communion stuff, and the church just continues to fill with people that have work to do on a Sunday morning. And you choose to be here, so I feel like I'm preaching to the choir a little bit. But I would suggest that maybe if you could listen with the idea that perhaps there's certain areas in your life that maybe need more attention. I loved Peggy's devotion today, because she talks about, how are we supposed to be waiting for Jesus? And that's really what today's message is about, is waiting for Jesus. And the beautiful example of Peggy and Tolly, listening to the Word of God and starting their day with the Word of God. Now, you may not have the flexibility that they have, but you do have the ability to listen to God on a regular basis in your daily walk. So here's what I want to do. I want to take a look at what it means to be selectively lazy, because I think that's more of an issue for us than perhaps the general idea of slothfulness. Most of you come out of your tree more than once a week. But as I was preparing for this message, I discovered, I can be slothful. Even when I feel like I'm busy, I can be selectively slothful. And it's probably my biggest regret as a father and as a husband, that there are moments as I look back that I chose to be selectively lazy, and I blamed it on being busy. I stood before God and witnesses and promised my wife that she would be before all other people on the planet to me. And too often I let ministry or other things take precedence over my marriage. And most of the time it was subtle. Somebody walked in and it was time to go home, and I had said I'd be home, but somebody walked in and they needed something. Well, isn't that what we're there to do, is like meet a need? And so that done on occasion is one thing, but to make it a habit to where you're just known for never showing up on time because you're always caught in something, always busy. And I just think back to those moments. There were no love affairs or obvious absences in my life as a father, but too often I gave my best energy to things other than my family. And I wonder if that isn't a sign of being selectively slothful. And today I pay the price for that. As a matter of fact, this week I paid the price for that. Let me give you a couple of examples. This week I had a young man from our college ministry who, a few years back, who now has a handyman business. And he was out and he fixed these 2 doors that I've been putting off when I've been selectively lazy. Like, I couldn't figure out how to fix them myself, but it's funny, when I was getting ready to sell it and the realtor said, get this done, I found a way to get it done. And maybe I should have been listening or working harder or taking more initiative in some of the projects around the house instead of taking care of some of the projects around other people's houses over the years. My dad was a painter, and you know what they say about painters and plumbers? Painter's house is the last house painted. The plumber's plumbing always needs work. The mechanic's car never runs, because we're always putting other people ahead of us. And we think that that's the way it's supposed to be. I remember in Sunday school learning, Jesus, others, and you. What a wonderful way to spell joy. But sometimes you need to put the needs of your family ahead. And you can't just use, well, I'm busy, as an excuse for laziness at times. And I think if we're honest, We all have this issue. Like, we all struggle a little bit with this. Let's just talk about men because men are the obvious target for this. I may be going out on a limb here, but I'm just going to guess that I'm not the only man in the room who can be selectively slothful. That at the end of the day, when the best energy is gone and been given at work, it's super easy to come back and find that, well, they don't call it a lazy woman, it's a lazy boy that we sit in and put our feet up in. I think that's because lazy women chairs would not sell. But there's a huge market for lazy boys, right? I don't know. Maybe I'm stretching it here a little bit to get there, but what happens when we give our best energy to work? Well, we neglect other areas of our life. And I'm not going to preach this sermon, but if this is an area of struggle for you, Andy Stanley has a really good book called Choosing to Cheat. I don't know if you've ever read an Andy Stanley book, but you can usually read it, at a stoplight. I mean, they're never really long, and they're not terribly in depth, and they're always straight on point. And he has this choosing to cheat. His philosophy is simply this: we all cheat someone, but who will we choose to cheat? And he's specifically talking to men when he says, when you're at work, you choose. Are you going to cheat your employer, or are you going to cheat your family? And he says something that most of us would just find incredibly, just like an incredibly bad idea. And he says, cheat your employer. Now, he doesn't mean steal from them. He just means when it's time to stop, stop. When it's time to go home, go home. Don't let that person rob your family of their father or their mother, because the truth is, it's not just about men. It's about all of us. And it's not just about work. It can be about our free time. Like, if you spend more time looking at a screen in your downtime than you do during chores, you might be selectively slothful. If you haven't helped cook this week, and this is men, women, child, whomever, if you haven't been in the kitchen this week to help, you might be selectively slothful. If you spent 50 hours working and had nothing left for your children, you might be selectively slothful. Or if you spent more time reading fake news than reading to your kids or your grandkids, you might be selectively slothful. If you spend more time leveling up on player unknown battleground, like 100+ million players did this week, you might be selectively slothful. I'm not much of a gamer as far as big games go, and I don't want to pick on any gamers. A lot of people I love are gamers, and honestly, I think in the next generation, gamers will own the world if they don't already. But I just did I've got like 2.5 pages here of stats. I'm not going to share it with you, but just looking at this one game that probably most of you haven't played, but you're a minority in the world by not playing this game. PlayerUnknown's Battleground has been the most popular game, I think, for the last 2 years. 227 million monthly players, 87 million daily players of this game. Okay? That's a lot of time playing video games. That's a lot of people devoted to it. How many people play on their phones? Over 100 million daily active users play it on their phones. This is as of 2 years ago, and it's growing exponentially. Doesn't even include China, and China makes up for 33% of all users of this online mobile game. But I just wanted to give you an idea. Number of PUBG mobile players in China before they changed it to Game for Peace was 70 million active users. And this game has surpassed 55 million daily active users on all platforms, even if you don't include China. So you're talking about a lot of people. People just trying to learn how to play this game or get better at it, that are just watching somebody else play the game. Over 200 million hours as of April of this year were spent just watching other people play this game. Okay? Peak number of concurrent players on this game on Steam, 3.2 million. That's 3.2 million players playing all at the same time. this online game. The statistics blow your mind. 500 million people watched the big tournament last year. There's a $14 million prize for the person that won that game. That's a huge amount of people in a huge amount of time. I can't even begin to imagine how much time a person has to play, 3 to 4 hours a day to even get close to competing for that prize. It blows my mind. I don't want to chase that rabbit anymore, but I want you to understand that we might be busy and still be slothful. And maybe for you, it's not video gaming. Maybe there's some other hobby or thing that captures your attention, because honestly, there's a lot of things that capture our attention. Like, how many series on Netflix have you binged during the month of July? We're like a week and a half into July. These are the things that capture our attention. It's not just men and boys playing video games or girls playing video games. Women, before you wear out your elbows on your men doing one of these, I'm going to suggest you might have your own struggle with selective slothfulness. Social media. How many hours do you spend on your social media account? It's always very handy to me, but also kind of scares me how many people respond immediately to a question or a post. I had a friend last night, my nephew, 11:30 at night up in Omaha where the power lines are down and everything. He puts a post out there that says, okay, strange question here, but I've got trees on my entrance to the house, the line coming from the pole to the house, and but I have power on, so I don't really feel like I can go out and do it. Whose responsibility is that? Is that the city? Is it the power company? You guys have probably had this question before, right? Like, it's not a new thing to you to have trees on your power lines. But he's a new homeowner. He's like, what do I do? Who do I contact? How do I make this happen? And the answers didn't surprise me. It was the number of answers after 11:30 at night in a city without power that shocked me. We're there, we're on it, we're in it. And it can be used for good. Even doing good things on social media can still demonstrate some selective slothfulness, because if we're so engaged in our virtual relationships on social media, it can become kind of an escape so that we don't have to deal with real people in real time, in real life, face to face. It's sort of a lazy way to have a relationship. It's so funny to me. Sometimes I'll go up and I'll have a conversation with somebody. Hey, so what have you been up to lately? Well, didn't you see? We were on vacation. Didn't you see my pictures? Didn't you see? It's like, if they posted it, I should know it, and even harder for me, I should remember it, right? And not only that, why didn't I like it? I didn't put an emoji up there, and some of you are like, what's an emoji? And that's okay. You don't ever need to know that. So here's the thing. Most of the women I know work hard, but don't always do the hard work. And here's what I mean by that. I don't mean I'm not talking about pouring concrete. I'm not talking about physical labor. Most of you work very hard physically. But I'm talking about, for example, thinking of men and women in relationship to one another. Sometimes it's hard work to figure out how to navigate that relationship and some of the struggles, especially when you're dealing with somebody who's selectively slothful. And so I think it's important for us to remember not to give up in that fight, that your family, your relationship, it's worth it. And that's not just for women, that's for men too. So these are the problems, these are the struggles. Does God have anything to say about this? Does God's word have anything to say about our work? Does he really care? Well, let's start where we left off last week in the book of 1 Timothy chapter 6. I didn't really preach much on this last week, but it was kind of the end of the message time, and I could tell I'd already taken a little bit too much of your time, so I want to come back to this. If you remember that the weapon used against greed is generosity. And at the end of that passage, Paul writes to Timothy and he says, command them. Do you remember who them would be referring to? These would be those who were rich in this world. And he says, command the rich. By the way, anybody know any rich people in the world? Like we said last week, we probably are in the top 3% if we didn't walk here today. Probably in the top 1% if we received more than $33,000 in income this last year. That's us he's talking to. He says, so command the church to be rich in good deeds and to be generous and willing to share. So God has this concern that we do good work, that we do good deeds. Not to earn our way to heaven, that's already been secured for us. But as an expression of our gratefulness to God, he calls us to be rich in good deeds, and he tells us what this looks like. He gives us this image. He says, in this way they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so they may take hold of the life that is truly life. And I love the way Paul phrases this. He gives us kind of a double image. One is that someday in heaven, we will experience these treasures. But what is the life that is truly life? I'm not convinced that's just about the life to come. I think that's about the life here too. I think it's about being a part of the kingdom of God here on earth. And so I want to talk a little bit more about that, so it's not just my opinion, but I wanted to start where we left off. There's a couple of other passages that talk about the great work that God calls us to do. The next one is over, if you just turn over a couple of pages, in the book of Titus. And honestly, if I were to outline the book of Titus for you, or this little letter, it would simply say this: the end is near. You should be waiting and watching and working while you wait. That's essentially a one-line summary of the letter of Titus. It's like, Jesus is going to come again, and you should be watching for him, and you should be waiting for him, and the whole time that you're doing that, you should also be working for him. So in chapter 2, starting at verse 14, which interrupts a sentence. I mean, Paul has these long sentences. So I'll read 14 and then I'll come back and read the rest of it. Jesus Christ, who gave himself for us to redeem us from all wickedness and purify himself a people that are his very own, eager to do what is good. One of the marks of a saved individual is that they become eager to do what is good. Let's back up now and read the passage before this so we don't take it out of context. Starting at verse 9. Actually, starting at verse 11. For the grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men. It teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in this present age, while we wait for our blessed hope, the glorious appearing of our great God and Savior Jesus Christ, who gave himself up for us to redeem us from all wickedness and to purify himself a people that are his very own, eager to do what is good. See, Paul puts it in this context. It says, yes, we are saved through Jesus Christ, and we are waiting for his return. And while we wait, one of the marks of the church, of a saved group of people, is that they become eager to do what is good. We're eager to do great works. Well, without just looking at what Paul said about this, I want to look at, spend the rest of our time in the book of Matthew, chapter 25. And this is not the first time I've preached from this chapter since I've been here. It was actually, I hit on a verse in it early on. But I want us to take a look at this entire chapter. When we were learning Greek, our Greek professor said, okay, there are two ways that you can study fish. You can buy an aquarium and get a fish and study that fish, one fish at a time, or you can go to the ocean and swim with the fish and see how they interact with each other. And both of those are great ways to study fish. Sometimes when we're studying a passage, We need to, take and break down every little piece of the passage. But other times, it's good to see the way that they swim together. And so that's what I want to do today. We're going to look at a whole chapter, but we're not going to break down every little piece of it. We're going to look at Matthew 25, and what we're trying to understand here is, does God have anything to say about our slothfulness or about our need to do great work? And Timothy, or Paul's already written that to Timothy, he's already written that to Titus, but all of this is based on the teachings of Jesus. And I think Matthew 25 is as good of an example of that as we're going to find anywhere in Jesus' teaching. Here's the thing, the disciples came to him in the previous chapter, and they're like, okay, Jesus, so would you tell us the time that you're going to be back? Like, you say you're going to come again. When should we expect you back? And Jesus basically, this is my summary of chapter 24. Jesus basically says, wrong question. I don't even know the answer to that, which we could talk about that a long time, but we're not going to. He says, those things, like when I'm coming back, that's not what you should focus on. And then he tells 3 stories that help us understand what we should focus on while we watch and wait for him to return. And so let's look at these 3 stories rather quickly. The first story is the story of the 10 bridesmaids. Now, if you're reading in the NIV, it says the 10 virgins, and most of the translations actually call them the 10 virgins, but I like saying bridesmaids better. It's just this picture that we have in our culture that says these are young women eager to be married. Have you ever been at a wedding and there's all the bridesmaids and there's the bride and there's the saying, always a bridesmaid, never the bride. You have these young ladies and they're just eager. Some of them are maid of honor, but the bridesmaids themselves that are just eager. They're excited about the wedding. They're eager for what's to take place. And in this story, there are 10 bridesmaids and they're waiting for a bridegroom. I think this is like the Jesus version of The Bachelor, right? Like these 10 ladies are waiting for this guy to show up and pick one of them to ride off into the sunset and live happily ever after with. The problem is 5 of these women are not prepared. They don't have the oil for their lamps. And so they have to go and get oil for their lamps. And while they're gone doing that, the bachelor shows up, the groom, and makes his choice. And they're like, they were not there, they were not prepared. And Jesus summarizes that story very simply. He said, let's go down to verse 11. Later, the others also came. Sir, sir, they said, open the door for us. These are the 5 that didn't make it into the count because they were off looking for oil. But he replied, I tell you the truth, I don't know you. Therefore, keep watch because you do not know the day or the hour. So the disciples say, what's the day and the hour that you're coming? And he says, you don't know the day and the hour, so keep watch, be diligent, be prepared. Because it could come at any time, and you don't want to be like, these bridesmaids that missed out on their chance. I think the other thing is he's saying in here is don't get distracted. Like, I'm sure there was a reason that these women forgot their oil. It's because they weren't focused on what was ahead. They weren't preparing for the bridegroom. Maybe it's because they were too busy, looking at their image in the mirror, updating their Instagram, whatever version of that it is in their life at that time. But they were distracted. My guess is they were busy, but they were pursuing the wrong thing, so they were selectively lazy because they didn't prepare and they weren't watching. So then Jesus tells the second story, and this is a familiar story with us as well. And I think one of the most, one of the most preached on passages in the church, really. We love to preach on this second story, especially when the funds are low at the church and we want to raise up the offering. But it's a story of the talents, about these 3 servants that when their master is going away, he entrusts different talents to different servants. To one servant, he entrusts that servant with 5 talents, another one 2 talents, and the final one 1 talent. And he gives each of these servants a generous portion to take care of. Do you understand what a talent is? In the text, in the NIV, it says a talent of gold. Almost every other translation says a talent of silver. So I went back to the initial to say, I wonder which it is, because there's a huge difference. At this point in time, the gold would have been valued about 30 times what silver was. So a talent of gold versus a talent of silver, significant difference. And so I was like, well, what's it say? Well, unfortunately, the text doesn't have the word gold or silver in it. It just says talent. Now, we do know from that time that most talents, most of the talent was made up of 6,000 denarii. And 6,000 denarii, each of those denarii were typically silver coins. And so a talent of silver denarii would have a value today of about $1.35 million. That's a lot of denarii, okay? And if it's gold instead of silver, it's worth 30 times that, which if you do a little research or if you love coins, I know a few of you like to study these types of facts, you can find gold denarii. They did exist, but typically it was silver. So we're going to go with the silver number, okay? But I just want you to have an understanding that the master entrusted a great deal to the steward. Here's the first thing that we need to learn from this story. Everything belongs to God, and he entrusts us with stewards according to our abilities. That'll be the second part. But he entrusts everything we have as a trust from God in you. Okay? Now, these 3 servants, 1 talent of silver, 6,000 denarii. 1 denarii is equal to 1 day's work. So 6,000 denarii is approximately 24 years of a 5-day work week. I don't know what that is for your employment, but I do know this. It's not a small sum, right? The average wage in Beaumont, the average hourly wage in Beaumont is $28.19 an hour. And that's how I come up with the idea that this is $1.35 million worth of silver. It's a huge amount of money. Now, one person gets 5 times that amount. 5 times 24, like that's more money than you can make in 2 lifetimes. Matter of fact, 2 times that is probably more money than most people can make in a lifetime. Most people, 48, 50 years, that's a pretty good career. So all 3 of these servants are giving very generous portions. There's a couple of translations that say, well, to one was given 1 coin and to another 2 coins and the other 5 coins. Doesn't even cover it, unless, a super rare coin. But here's the thing. As we look through this, God was incredibly generous and trusted all 3 stewards with large sums of money. And what did they do with them? Well, let's actually read this part of the parable, starting at verse 14. Again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents of money, to another 2 talents, and to another 1 talent, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. The man who had received the 5 talents went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 more. So also the one with 2 talents gained 2 more. But the man who had received the 1 talent went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. The master doesn't entrust the same to everyone. According to verse 15, he gives to everyone according to their abilities. I think this culture is struggling with that idea, that God entrusts some with some amount and others with a different amount. And I think part of the reason we struggle with it as a culture is because in our past and in our present and probably in our future, some people are given a great portion, but others take a great portion. And there's a difference between what God gives you and what you take and the price of other people. So without getting into that portion of it, here's what I think we need to understand from this. God is not a fair God. God is not a communist. God is a benevolent dictator. He chooses who he will entrust with different talents. Now, the word talent in the English has kind of a double entendre. It's the idea that this is both about money, but it's also about our talents. You know, as we used to talk about when I was growing up, God entrusts us with our talents, our time, our treasures, and our talents. You know, those three areas. And this is probably about all three of those, and at least the chapter is. I like what John Maxwell says about this regarding, God entrusting us. Basically, God gives everybody potential, and Maxwell says this: your potential is God's gift to you, and what you do with it is your gift to God. And I think this passage really demonstrates that well. So here's our problem, though. We tend to see 1, 2, and 5 and say that's just not fair. And we tend to compare ourselves. So if we're the 1 person, we're comparing ourselves with the 2 person, or the 2 person comparing ourselves with the 5 talent person, and the 5 talent person comparing themselves to Jeff Bezos or whoever. That's last week's message about more. We have this idea that whatever we've been entrusted with, we should have been entrusted with more. But did you notice that the second servant doesn't worry about the fact that he has more than 1 person or less than the other? It just simply invests 100% and gets a 100% return. You see, we get caught in this comparison thing. We'll talk about this more during week 6 when we talk about envy. But we tend to compare ourselves, and here's the problem with that. Like if we compare ourselves, and I'd say this is where it happens a lot today. If we compare ourselves with social media, for example, if we're looking at somebody's Instagram or we're looking at their Facebook and we see their thing, like I like to take July off of social media because when I go through it, all I see is people's vacation pictures. And I don't look at their vacation pictures when I'm on vacation. I vacation. But man, they have such better vacations than I do. And it seems like everybody's on vacation all the time. So here's the deal. We compare their highlight reel with our blooper reel. It's like their best times with our struggle times. And it doesn't work. This is a lose-lose situation. Or, we will compare ourselves with these people, and as a result of comparing ourselves with other people, one of 2 things happens. And both of them are sin, and I would even go beyond sin and say both of them are deadly and toxic to our souls. In the one case, we compare ourselves to somebody else, and their life looks so much better than us, or their talent looks so much better, the resources God's entrusted to them look so much better than us, and we think less of ourselves than we should, because God has given us a talent. He's entrusted us generously as well. I mean, if you're taking a breath today, take a breath. What a great gift God gave us just in the ability to take a breath today. And we get caught up in comparing ourselves to what other people have for the day, and it throws us. The second thing that we do that can be pretty toxic is, we might beat ourselves up because we don't compare, but we will also puff ourselves up when we do compare. And I was just having a conversation with this kid. His dad was a great mentor or help to me, died tragically, and so I stay in touch with this guy's son, who's in academia and never earned a degree. He's published on many different subjects and has no degree. He's very against the idea of academia, which is a very group of people that he talks to. And he put this question out there the other day. He said, so what should we call this phenomena where people in a group of people compare themselves to the people around them and recognize, well, they're the best in that group. But that group is a small, select group of people. It's like being the smartest kid at the community college. And that's not to knock community college, but here's what happens when you're the smartest kid in the small pool. What happens when you get into a larger pool? A lot of people do community college for 2 years and then go on to get another degree for 2 years, and all of a sudden they're not in the academic elite. And that blows their mind. Or another example of this would be just in your career field. Like you might be the expert on this issue in your company, and so you're satisfied with that, and you're never challenged to grow beyond to fulfill the potential you actually have. And he said, what should we call this phenomenon? Should we call it the best phenomenon? And I'm like, I think it's the better than fallacy. I'm better than the other people around me, so that means I've fulfilled my potential. When in reality, that's not the case. It sort of reminds me of when my son was playing Little League, and we went to play this game, and it wasn't an official game. It was like an extra game that we lined up so that players that don't usually get to play would have a chance to play. And we get there, and we're in this place in Missouri, and the pitcher, the other team gets injured, and so they bring in another pitcher. The problem is our team was made up of 10 and 11-year-olds, and they brought in a 17-year-old pitcher. He was the best pitcher on the field that day. Surprise, right? But I'll never forget when Noah Harvey stood up to the plate, this little guy, scrawny guy, didn't hit anything hardly all year. And I said, Noah, you just stand in there and you give him a look that that says, I've got this. And then when that ball comes, you just swing. And Noah got his first multi-base hit that day off of a high school player. Do you know what kind of confidence he had the rest of the season? It's where he fell in love with baseball. That's a story he will tell for the rest of his life, the day that this 11-year-old hit off of a 17-year-old. But that's kind of the scenario. We tend to puff ourselves up, and sometimes maybe it's not something we should be puffed up about. Both of those things can be toxic to us. What else can we learn from this passage? Well, let's go down to verse 19. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. And we know how that settlement went. Here's the bottom line. The master will return. The master will settle his accounts. And it's probably a reason that this story stuck out so much to Matthew. Matthew, the tax collector. He's like, we are all going to give an account. That day is going to come for us. So if you take these three stories together, what is Jesus saying? He's saying, keep watch, like don't be caught off guard like the disappointed bridesmaids. He says, invest yourself the way that like you trust the master who's given you a trust. Now, I told you that I preached on this passage before, and it really had to do with this part here. It says, verse 20, the man who had received the 5 talents brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 talents. See, I've gained 5 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. And then the man with 2 talents also came. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 2 talents. See, I've gained 2 more. And his master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things, and I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. He didn't have to bring back 5 talents to make the master happy. He just fully invested what the master gave him. And then we get to the third servant. Verse 24, then the man who had received the 1 talent came. Master, he said, I knew that you're a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you've not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your talent in the ground. See, Here is what belongs to you. And his master replied, you wicked, lazy servant. Now I want to pause there for a minute. This is where the story is a struggle for me. Because if I think about the person with 5 talents, how do you think he doubled and got those 5 talents? I mean, we're talking 5 times $1.35 million. How can one servant manage that many resources? My guess is he entrusted those resources to a team of people. He found other people that were trustworthy, and he provided leadership to those people, and they invested in and got behind it. They worked. Because that's how people with resources get it done. I imagine that's even true for the person with the 2 talents. I don't know how you can turn that into nearly $3 million without help. Remember, this is the equivalent of 24 years' wages for one of those. So nearly 50 years' wages is what he brings back. It's a lot of work just to haul that into the place, right? But you know who I think had the most sweat and dirt and grime under their nails with this? I think it was the 1 talent person. And hear me out. What did he do with it? He went and dug a hole. You ever dug a hole? Okay. Have you ever dug a hole big enough and deep enough to protect $1.35 million? Can you imagine what that hole is like? What's involved, the sweat that's involved, the blood, sweat, and tears, to dig a hole deep enough that you feel safe, that money is going to be safe and protected? What is that, 1 foot, 2 feet, 6 feet, 12 feet? I don't know how deep you can dig that hole and feel safe. But that's what this guy did. Not only that, he dug the hole to put the money there, but he had to dig it again to get it back out of the hole to give it to the master when he heard he was coming. How can the master call him lazy? Because he misappropriated the work. He was to invest that money. The master comes back and he gives him ideas. He's like, you could have done this super easy and way more profitable and way less sweat if you'd have just taken the money to the bank. You wicked, lazy servant, verse 26. So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. Well, then you should have at least put my money on deposit with the bankers so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. And here's the hard part for us to accept and even understand the process. Take the talent from him and give it to the one who has the 10 talents. That doesn't seem fair, does it? But isn't this what you would do with your resources? Let's say that you're building your portfolio for retirement, that glorious retirement that was talked about. And you have one broker you've entrusted with 5 talents and they earn you 5 more, one that you've invested with 2 talents and they earn you 2 more, and one that just buried it, did nothing with it, didn't even give you interest. What would you do with the one? You'd do the same thing. You'd invest it with the person who had been most trustworthy, person who had been responsible. But then it gets even harder because it's a hard truth that he's teaching. Verse 29 still. For everyone who has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken from him. And throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now that's a hard teaching to swallow, even if you do have teeth. You're going to say that God is punishing that servant for not investing appropriately? And Jesus says yes. Now I want you to remember the context. Remember, we're swimming in the ocean, not looking at the aquarium. Jesus has said, wait and watch and work. Like, do great work here. Invest this life you have because the end is near. And he's looking at this servant saying, you were wasteful. You squandered the opportunity that I gave you. And then Jesus gets more specific. And I think, again, all three of these are woven together masterfully. Jesus tells the third story. It's about the sheep and the goats. Oh, before I go there, I don't know if you remember, but I shared this verse 19, this idea of, verse 21. Well done, good and faithful servant. That's my rule of life. I shared that with you, and I think I got a picture of it, of the kid on the tricycle. I don't know if you remember that series, but it was a series just talking about well done, good and faithful servant, and broke down each and every one of those words, that we should live a life of excellent, well done. We should live a life of action, well done. We should do great things. I want to live my life with the life of humility, well done, good and faithful servant. And I want to live a life of faithfulness, well done, good and faithful servant. And I want to live that life as a servant, well done, good and faithful servant. Jesus in this story paints a vision for our life that says, do great work, humbly, faithfully, and as a servant. See, sometimes laziness isn't about not working. It's about misusing the gifts we've been given. So instead of, well done, good and faithful, he might say, yeah, I see you did some things. I don't want him to say that about me. I want him to say, you did good things. Well done. So here's the third story, the story of the two choices. And this is where we see what this settlement of accounts looks like. I'm going to get through this pretty quickly. It's the story of the sheep and the goats, that when the Son of Man comes, in all his glory and the angels with him, he will sit on his throne in the heavenly glory, and all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. And you know this story. It's not a brand new one to you. I encourage you to go back and read it later. But here's how it ends. Here's the basic story. He says to one group, he says, well done, good and faithful. You come in, get your reward. For I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was naked, you clothed me. I was in prison, you visited me. He says, you met the needs. And they're like, I don't remember seeing you in prison. I don't remember seeing you naked. I think I would remember these things. And he says, well, as long as you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. And then he says to this other group of people who were probably people who had been busy doing really good things, but they overlooked the least of these, which meant they overlooked Jesus' call on their life. I think this story is less about just choosing a vocation, but living life in a way that we see Jesus in the people around us. I don't think that Jesus is saying with these three stories that every person needs to start a homeless shelter, or every person needs to be a minister at a church, every person ought to be this, that, or the other. I think what he's saying is, as you go and as you work, do great things for the least of these. Understand the people that you have around you and do great things. Be concerned with justice. So, the two things I get out of this story is, one is God rewards great work, not just hard work. Sheep, goats, both worked hard, would be my guess. But the people that he called into his kingdom were the ones that did great things for his kingdom. And they did so by taking care of the least of these. Second truth that we see in this story is that God punishes the lazy and selectively slothful. These people did good works too, I'm sure of it. They were busy. They overlooked the least of these. So what would happen if we took this chapter and began to think about it in our own lives? What if we would slay the sloth in our lives, even the selective sloth, and do great work? What if we did that at home? Like, we stopped being selectively lazy and we looked over the needs of the people around us in our home. My guess is some of the people that have the greatest needs in your life are around, probably under a roof or in your neighborhood? What would happen if you'd slay the sloth in your life at work and do great work at work? One of the things that has amazed me over the years is how little work gets done at work. Have you ever noticed that? We used to put in cable system. I used to put in network cabling for different businesses, and one of the things that one group we worked with was a group of engineers, 140 engineers under the same roof, and I couldn't believe how many of them were playing solitaire half the day on their computer while they waited for things to upload or download. Or, as you've experienced at your work, somebody who's not busy goes and sits in the office of somebody who is busy, tries to look busy, talking about busy things when they're really just being a busybody, not really working. What would happen if we would slay the sloth and just do great work when we're at work? Maybe that would give us more time for home. Here's another one. What about the church? I love this church. This church is a group of people that get very busy about very good things. And I so appreciate that. That's why I was scared to preach this message, because most of you helped rebuild this building, right? You got a lot of sweat equity into this building. How would we ever have a slothful, lazy person in our church? But sometimes we get so caught up in doing church that we overlook Jesus, either in the needs of the people around us or just our own need to spend time with him. And I would just encourage you to slay the sloth and do great work, and part of that is making sure you sit at the feet of Jesus. Well, here's the question that I want to wrap up with today, and this is a question I just love to ask students, and it's really a pretty simple question. The question is simply this: if you knew that you wouldn't fail, what would you do with your life? I asked that question at camp in 1989, in camp at Louisville, Nebraska. And three people that were sitting in that camp. Eli Davidson went on to Romania and ministered with several hundred orphans for about 10 years of his life. He was focused on that mission. Tori Satter and his wife now have almost 20 years in Globe, Arizona with 318 Ministries because they wanted to do something big for Jesus. Mark Thornton moved into the inner city and started Jacob's Well in Lincoln, Nebraska, as well as in Haiti as an outreach to these orphans. And it was simply because of this question: if you knew you wouldn't fail, what is a great work that God is calling you to? And honestly, I think that's what we as a church need to be working on right now. As we transition back into our culture, as we rebuild, as things begin to become normal, what if our normal would return to this idea of doing great work? Doing great work. Not to earn points with Jesus or not to earn points and be famous in our community, but because one day we're going to stand before the Lord and we want to hear, "Well done, good and faithful church." Would you stand as we pray? God, I just want to thank you for this church, and I pray that this message will be received the way it's intended, which is simply that you are the God that forgives our sin, and you're a God that shapes us into something new. God, would you renew our commitment to do great work to bring glory to your name, that you might work in the hearts and minds of the people in this church, but also in our neighborhoods, people that we work with, the people we encounter every day. Thank you, Father, for Christ's covenant. We go forth in the name of Jesus, our Lord. Amen.